So the state of North Carolina caused a little bit of a stir when it came out that they are moving to 8 classifications for their high school sports. And it started a conversation on wrestling Twitter about the values or the negatives and positive aspects of having that many classifications. And I think there's really some very different realities in high school athletics, high school sports, and particularly high school wrestling. When you look at a state like North Carolina, which now will have 8, you look at a state like Virginia, my home state that I love, has 6 plus the 7th with private school. Compare that to New Jersey, which has 1. California, the nation's most populous state, has 1 classification for their state tournament. There's some very different realities out there, and there's people on either side of the argument. Some people think, hey, you're trying to figure out who the state champion, who's the best in the state. You only need 1 class, and we don't need to water it down or make it easier so that there's more state champions. That's not a good thing. And there's the other side of the coin that says, hey, it's a good thing to have multiple classifications for the different advantages and disadvantages that the bigger schools have compared to the smaller schools. And I come at this, admittedly, from a pretty biased position. I'm from a really, really small town in Virginia called Churchville. I went to Buffalo Gap High School, and I coached there for a number of years. It's a really, really small high school. And I saw a lot of the benefits of the multiple classifications in Virginia. Now, I will say this. When I was wrestling and coaching, we had the 3 classifications for most of that time. And I really liked that. I thought that was the perfect blend. It made it really, really tough to qualify for the state tournament. It made a state championship very difficult to attain. Buffalo Gap has only had a handful of them in their entire history since the sport was founded at Buffalo Gap in 1989. So it was a really, and it was a solid single A wrestling program. Not the best by any means, but pretty good. And I think there's a lot of positive benefits of having this. And I think more than anything, I think the end of all, I think there's a disconnect on the actual purpose of high school athletics, right? And I think the people that are staunchly 1 class really believe that, hey, just determining who's the best is the purpose of high school sports generally. Well, I believe the purpose is that sports teach intangibles and life lessons that are really, really important. It reinforces the value of hard work, the value of teamwork, of dedication, of focus, of sacrifice. Right? These are things that have lifelong, life-lasting implications and positive benefits for you, right? Not to mention the positive aspect of giving kids something to do instead of, being at home left to their own devices. We all know that can lead to some pretty negative consequences. So getting a kid involved with sports with good mentorship with coaches and good teamwork, camaraderie, that's just a really positive benefit. And it's still to this day, I'm really blessed with the job I get to have. But those memories of coaching and those teams are still some of the most fond memories of my career, right? There's nothing like that. So I think I've just seen the benefits of high school athletics. And I think there's also the element of attainability is really, really important. Smaller schools maybe will only have 1 wrestler in a weight class or have to forfeit weight classes. There's such an competitive imbalance. While these larger schools, they have a bigger talent pool. They have full-time coaches. They have more coaches. They have, better facilities. They have depth. And that's just a reality that's just not afforded to a lot of the other smaller schools, right? And so these big schools can field better teams just because of sheer numbers, right? Whereas the smaller schools, that's just not realistic, And the classifications, they ensure that the teams compete against similar sized schools. That levels the playing field a little bit, but it makes it attainable, right? Multiple classes encourage participation, right? If you know that you're gonna come out and you're just gonna get killed every single time, it's a tough sell to get someone to come out. But if you say go to a freshman, go to something, be like, hey, if you work hard, if you focus, you dedicate yourself, you could be, all district, or you could be a state qualifier, maybe even a state champion. That realistic competitive pathway, That's really important. And I think that's something you have only when you have different classifications based on school size. Now, can it go too far? Absolutely. 6 for Virginia, that's way too much. It doesn't make sense for a state like Virginia. 8 for North Carolina, I'm thinking that doesn't make sense either. I don't understand that. And you can tell when it's starting to water it down too much. If you have like default state qualifiers where all you have to do is enter the qualifier and you're automatically at state tournament, that's not good. It shouldn't be that way. It should be a status to be a state qualifier. So when you end up in it's like this in Virginia in certain regions, especially in the smaller ones, it's like this. I'm sure it will be in North Carolina. That's not good, right? You don't want default state qualifiers, default state placers. You want a full bracket, right? That's when it can go too far. And I'm not disagreeing. I think there's a sweet spot of attainability, of rigor that makes high school sports really, really cool. You wonder how these small schools can field teams in some of these smaller worlds. And it really prevents, when you have the attainability for these rural areas, that's really good. You don't want all the state champions in Virginia, for example, you don't want all the state champions coming from Northern Virginia and the Tidewater area, two geographically small parts of the state, but population-wise represents a huge portion of it. I don't think that's a good thing. I think you want, geographic diversity, right? Where everyone from everywhere has a chance. Now, there's no guarantees. You're not going to ultimately get a state champion just because you're from a rural area. But it's just good to have that attainability, right? And for wrestling, it's in a really beautiful position because if you are the best of the best at your state and you're striving for more and you're the best in the nation, that is an attainable thing in the sport of wrestling. You can enter the Super 32. You can enter all the USA wrestling events. You can enter some of these premier national tournaments and prove yourself in that way. But I feel like for the state tournaments, for the state championships, it's for a different purpose. It's not just to determine or prop someone up as the best of the best in the nation. It's to give a really worthwhile experience. And so while I see the positive and benefits of both sides, I think there is a sweet spot. And I think as a state like California really isn't doing their population a huge benefit when you only have one classification. I think they would really benefit from having multiple. So anyways, that's my opinion. I know there's a lot of opinions about this. I've seen the benefits of how these classifications help small schools. And I think unless you've experienced that, you can't travel outside that, 30 miles or 60 miles unless it's for district regional competition. There's so many little things that probably you don't even take for granted or don't even realize if you had kind of a big school background or you went to a traditional power. Like Johnny DeJulius, he's big time against the classifications, it seems. But he grew up in Cleveland area, a wrestling hotbed. He went to Walsh Jesuit High School, a tradition of wrestling that's really, really strong there, right? That's the school that hosts Ironman tournament. He maybe doesn't know the experience of a small school wrestling. I'm not saying Johnny doesn't. This is a guy who travels around the country, does camps all over the place. Love Johnny. But I think if you haven't lived that experience, it's sort of hard to understand the actual benefits for these smaller schools. So anyways, this was kind of rambling all over the place a little bit. Appreciate you indulging this, but curious for your thoughts on what you believe the sweet spot is for high school sports, particularly as it comes to classifications.